Today's episode of Theoretically Speaking features Jeff Brown, Chief Scientific Officer, who will be speaking with Matvey Palchuk, Chief Medical Informatics Officer at TriNetX. They are discussing the rise of RWD and its role in revolutionizing healthcare research, and how the TriNetX team approaches research-ready RWD.
Matvey, as Chief Medical Informatics Officer and one of the oldest or longest employees at TriNetX, how's real-world data emerged as a significant resource in healthcare research? And what do you see as TriNetX's role in the healthcare research infrastructure?
Thank you, Jeff. So let me spend a few seconds to talk about specifically real-world data and what it means to us today. It used to be claims. People did a lot of research as well as work that relates to answering clinical questions using financial data, using claims. And more in the last couple of decades, data that is being collected at the point of care in electronic medical record systems is coming to the forefront. I believe that the clinical data from EMRs is a little bit closer to the actual state of the patient than financial data. It also has more clinically relevant details. So a typical example is there are labs and lab results, as well as other measurements like vital signs, present in the EMR data, and it is not present in claims. And so, of course, from the TriNetX's perspective, our goal is to first and foremost liberate that data from the primary sources, from the EMRs, where it's collected for the purposes of providing care, and then make it available to researchers for doing their work. One of the things that differentiates us is we are trying to do it at a global scale. We have presence in over 20 countries in the world, and one of the necessities that comes into play when trying to do this is data harmonization. So it's not just getting the data out of the primary sources and making it available, it's also harmonizing it so that you can ask the single question across the entire network and get meaningful answers back. And then, of course, as time goes on, we have to continuously innovate on the sources where the data is coming from, right? So you have to go beyond EMR and look at unstructured data and registries data and data from third-party testing labs and so on, as well as the methods by which that data makes its way to this platform. And a typical example is natural language processing, where you extract useful information from unstructured text. And again, eventually, it is all about democratizing research. It's about making this data available to researchers, its secondary use, so that interesting questions can be answered.
Thanks. I've always been struck that we've been using essentially financial transactions to study clinical concepts, and as a community for 20 or 30, maybe even 40 years, have been studying things like hypertension without knowing anyone's blood pressure or their weight or their BMI. So it really resonates that bringing in the clinical data is so important to be able to understand new research questions. Can you say more about the challenges in bringing in clinical data, labs, vital signs? We can even hold the NLP for the next question. But just thinking through how to bring that kind of data in, standardize it, harmonize it, even within a country, and then globally.
Certainly, we can give it a shot. So it reminds me of an old paper from the early 1990s out of Erasmus University. A professor there by the name of Vanderlei laid out what he called the first law of informatics. And he said that data must be used only for the purposes that it was collected for. So according to that law, data that was collected for the purpose of providing care, data in the EMRs, should really be used only for the purposes of providing care. And here we are clearly talking about secondary use of data. This is nothing new, right? It's a term of the art. It's an entire field of informatics. And so how does secondary use of data even comes about, right? So it is not a straightforward proposition. The data indeed hasn't been collected for the purposes of research. And so when we do this, we have to approach it very gingerly, and we have to be very well aware that, for example, this is not data collected for a clinical trial where everything is highly regimented. There is no missing data. You know exactly when a particular measurement took place, why it's there, and so on. This is different. This is data that echoes the process of delivering care. Putting that aside, the next interesting sort of criterion is data is highly heterogeneous. It differs from hospital to hospital, from healthcare delivery system to the next, and these differences magnify when you change geographic locales. As healthcare delivery systems differ, the reimbursement, the entire culture of medical fields, so does the data that these systems collect. And of course, in order to put it all together into a harmonized single network, it has to be taken into account. This heterogeneity needs to be managed. And then lastly, I talked about liberating the data, making it available. So I'm sort of implying actual physical movement of the data. It leaves one system, goes to another. And these transitions are fraught with all sorts of challenges. People build the pipelines by which the data travels, and each pipeline introduces all sorts of assumptions, right? And they may or may not correspond to how the ultimate users of this data think about its provenance, its sort of life cycle. And so that also needs to be taken into account. And it's interesting that we've been noticing over the last decade that the view of the field, folks who are involved in this notion of secondary use of data for research, the view is shifting from purely focusing on liberating the data and making it available to being able to extract useful information from this data. And so there's a very apparent focus on methodologies. How do you deal, given all the deficiencies perhaps, or all the idiosyncrasies of the data? How do you deal with them? How do you maximize what you have in order to answer your questions?
Thanks for that. I'm struck by how research really is a team sport at this point. There is no single person that's really able to understand the methods and the data and the complexities of data where you can do the work yourself. You really do have to have a data scientist, an epidemiologist, a clinician, analyst all together to generate that knowledge from data. And it's still difficult, even with all the experts. What would you say some of the key research areas where TriNetX data has had the most impact?
Well, let me start by saying, again, reiterating the nature of our network. So the network is federated, and what this means is data remains with the organizations that generated it in the first place. So we don't put it together into one single physical location. It remains sort of on the periphery of the network. And what travels back and forth are questions and answers. So people talk about this notion of bringing a question to the data. So the network is federated, and the way we talk to the data is synchronous. We can actually ask and get an answer in real time. There's no built-in delay. There are no gateways or necessities to seek approval. If you can formulate a question in the user interface of the TriNetX platform, you can actually push a button and get the answer back in less than a few seconds. And the beauty of that paradigm in this near real-time interaction with the data is that you can very quickly refine the questions you are asking. As you receive results, you can sort of tweak your criteria, the ways you're describing the population of patients in question, to quickly narrow in, to zero in on the exact population of interest. We, of course, talked about standardization, which is an absolute necessity in making such a federated network function. And another point to mention real quick, sort of as an introduction, is one must really understand various aspects of data quality when trying to interpret the answers that are coming back. And so you need this perspective of looking at the data from multiple institutions in order to really understand what it means to put it together and derive valuable answers. But to your specific question, Jeff, we try to be therapeutic area agnostic. The data covers all the diagnoses, all the procedures, medications, lab results. And of course, if you're doing research in a specific therapeutic area, these specific collection of data may or may not be perfect for every answer that you are trying to ask. So I'll give two examples. Oncology as a field, at the very beginning, initial questions about these populations of patients get very, very deep into the specifics of the disease, into disease severity, into molecular and genomic specifics of the tissues. And so sort of low-hanging fruit, the financially inspired data like diagnosis and procedures, things like medication lists, lab results, don't necessarily take you far enough, and you need to augment the data that's coming from the EMRs with additional information such as data that's collected in cancer registries, genomic results, even data that's extracted via natural language processing from narrative text like pathology reports, oncology notes, and so on, in order to put together a more complete picture. Another example I will give is metabolic and cardiovascular diseases. I think those lend themselves more naturally to the type of data that's typically collected in the EMR. And if you're studying diabetes, for example, or obesity, there's a wealth of data at your fingertips that you will need to answer your questions, practically immediately available from the EMR sources.
Thanks. So maybe I'll ask a question about looking forward. So we see the volume of data growing. Our ability to understand it and use it is growing, but there's still a lot of complexity, in particular data coming from electronic health records, whether it's labs or vitals or extracting information from notes, even more difficult, although some folks think you can push a button and get information out of notes. We know that that's not true. But looking forward, what do you see as the most significant kind of opportunities and challenges for real-world data? And I'll say across use cases, TriNetX uses our data, or our partners use the data for clinical trial optimization, protocol design, optimization, site selection, really important work that can speed clinical trial drug development. The data are also used for medication safety or medication product safety, burden of illness studies, health economic studies, and others. But where do you see kind of the community or the field going in the next 5 to 10 years, and what would be the biggest impact for you in your day if something were to change, if you had that magic wand?
That's a great question. So I'll try to take it in turn. Let's talk opportunities first. I think that one very important opportunity is ongoing attempts by the entire field of medicine. And this is happening globally. We see it playing out in different countries at different stages of computerization of healthcare delivery processes. We're continuing to use the phrase of my mentor, instrument healthcare delivery process, right? So we are documenting, we're measuring, we're recording in the digital environments what's going on with the patients and what are we doing to take care of them. This is the process that generates the data in the first place. And as we become better at instrumenting the delivery process, the quality of the data, quantity of course, but the quality of the data will increase over time. And we're all continuously learning on how to do this better. And obviously this is informed by the various use cases that are brought in to try to use this data. And it's primary uses, delivering of care, as well as secondary uses, Jeff, as you just mentioned, for research. The other opportunity is there's new technology and new regulatory evolution that we're seeing in our collective environments. So, for example, 21st Century Cures Act in the US introduced this notion that data must be shared by an application programming interface, API. This is not new in the space of computer science, but it is something new for the healthcare ecosystem. And this makes it, I described those pipes by which the data travels. This makes them more modern, makes them a little more reliable, hopefully, able to carry more standardized information, and all of it in order to make it a little bit easier to establish sharing of data among interesting parties. So that is definitely an opportunity, and it's very interesting to see this field evolve and hopefully progress toward making our tasks easier over time. And then sticking with the technology, obviously the latest development in artificial intelligence, large language models and their promise is opening up very interesting, at this point, questions and explorations, but hopefully that will transition to actual tangible benefits to the users of the data. These systems allow us to interact with the data at a very much higher scale, right? You can imagine asking an AI a question about the gist of clinical documents, right? Characterize what's going on. Even going beyond the single question, you can attempt to do this on a population of patients. And this is something that sort of old school tech is not capable of. And to finish, the last one in the space of opportunities that I want to mention is there is a very clear change of the entire culture of healthcare delivery systems. Folks who are in the clinical roles and in the administrative roles and in the roles of researchers, the notion of sharing data is becoming more acceptable. This has not been the case. If you go back a couple of decades, this was very much debatable. And now it is becoming an accepted fact that data is better when you actually mobilize it and make it available places where it is needed to answer questions. And if you pool it across multiple organizations, you actually increase its usefulness. And so we're definitely on a journey that's informed and influences, hopefully, this change in the culture of data sharing. To go to challenges, I think I will point out two, and we kind of talked about them already in the process. So it is still difficult to collect this data, right? We're still trying to add more and more sort of checkboxes, structured data entry paradigms into the workflows of clinicians. Clinicians resent it. They are strapped for time. They don't want to be data entry clerks. And so I think we're still waiting for better paradigms of data capture. Again, goes back to this notion of instrumenting the healthcare delivery process. How do we do this better? How do we go about capturing the data so it's more comprehensive and does not introduce undue burden on those who we expect to do this data collection processes? And the second one is the regulatory environments, government regulations, legislation, privacy regulations. They need to be addressed in order for all of this to function. So the more the legal and regulatory systems realize the importance of data sharing and the secondary use of data for research, I think the more the field will benefit, and the fewer restrictions there will be between the primary data collection and where we can use it to answer questions about entire populations of patients and inform how to take care of them.
Perfect. Yeah. So that's a really important, and we can probably end on that point. The more that the regulators, in fact, if the regulators and regulations can change to liberate data and make it a little more transferable within the legal structure. I think the community wants to make best use of the data, but we're also limited in what you can do with it just because of the legal structures in the US in particular, but Europe is actually even stricter. And those limitations in, I'll just call data sharing or movement of data, really make it difficult to do the research that improves public health, because we can't actually move the data, bring it together to answer those important questions. So thanks a lot, Matvey, for the time.
Thank you.
We hope you enjoyed this episode of Theoretically Speaking and that you'll tune in to future episodes where we chat with pharma value, evidence, and access experts. Don't forget to subscribe.